Hi there. Okay, so I'm Tom Harrison. We're here at the Wellington Library today. We're talking about my draft book, Searching for Richard Nixon, Finding Refuge and Making Home in Prince Edward County. Okay, so, I've got a few slides here to show, but I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a county resident. I've been here since the early 2000s. I've been resident since 2005. Actually have family connections through the base back to just after World War II. I had an uncle who lived in Wellington and was associated with Picton Air Force Base back then. I do wear a lot of hats. So I've done mostly teaching for the last few years, but I'm also a qualified lawyer. I teach at Queen's Law School from time to time, and the picture on the screen there is a guest speaker that I fortunately got. I got Thomas Cromwell, who's a former Supreme Court of Canada judge, who came in and addressed my class back in 2016, so I was lucky to have that. Actually, it says Dr. Thomas Harrison. I put that in brackets because I don't generally use the doctor, but I do have a PhD from Queen's in law from 2016. More locally, though, I've been teaching natural law, I guess you'd call it, in the sense that I've been farming. And so we've had a farm outside Cherry Valley for more than a decade. We have, a couple hundred acres there. We do a bunch of things and have done different things over the years. We've had beef cattle. We do principally hay. We grow a lot of hay, probably 80 acres of hay. We've had meat chickens and egg layers and a few other things. One of the things that we do is we have a private horse rescue. We rescue all kinds of animals. Most of our animals are rescued one way or another. But we rescue horses like Nixon, who I'm going to tell you passed an act in 1970 in which he rescued burros, donkeys, and wild mustangs on the western deserts in 1970. So I share that in common with Richard Nixon. And so a few more pictures about me. My better half, who appears in a few of the later slides, writes for Horse Canada, and so I graced the cover there a few years ago with this horse we call MC, Mysterious Code. This horse is a rescue horse that was rescued off a meat lot here in Canada. Unlike the United States, the US does not permit the consumption of horses for food, but Canada does, and so there are still abattoirs that slaughter horses for food. It's a practice that we've been working to try to mitigate for the last few years. And you can see me in the other picture there on my tractor with the hay baler a couple of years ago doing some baling. I should say the first part of my story, to begin at the beginning, occurs on a trip that occurs in 2016 with my close friend Arthur Milnes. I grew up with Arthur. He's a Kingston-based journalist and writer. He's done a bunch of things politically. He writes a lot about politics, and his work and career have brought him into contact with many high prominent officials, including Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, who we met in 2016. I had in fact met Jimmy Carter and had a couple of dinners and meetings with him prior to that. The larger picture of me of shaking Jimmy Carter's hand, I called him Mr. President. He said, "Oh no, it's just Jimmy." So I called him Mr. Jimmy. Me shaking Mr. Jimmy's hand there at the Plains Inn back in 2010. I'm there in my suit and tie with Rosalind Carter a couple of years later, and that one in the upper left-hand corner is in fact from our trip in 2016. Arthur had a book he was bringing down and was hoping to get a picture with Jimmy Carter, so that's what we're doing there. But in the car on the way down to Plains, Georgia, we started talking about prominent local people in Eastern Ontario that had been involved in politics. And so we talked about Johnny MacDonald, who of course has his Picton connection, and we talked about John Foster Dulles, who had a cottage on Mayduck Island. Arthur mentioned to me that he was aware of a story about Richard Nixon also visiting Prince Edward County and Picton and going into a bar to have a drink. It didn't have a lot of details about that, but I honestly wasn't sure that the story was true. And so this started for me a snowball of research and writing that has resulted in my book in 2023, where I looked to see whether or not Richard Nixon really did come to the county, and to answer several other questions that arose as I began the research. In between, I expressed my own personal story to a certain extent and talked a lot about the people, places of Prince Edward County and a lot of local anecdotes and local history. In 1987, the liquor laws were also a lot more restrictive, right? very difficult to, get service at odd hours. People were a little more, concerned about liquor laws, and to think that someone so high profile would come and just go drinking in what were only probably a few bars on Main Street in Picton was a little unusual. So I wondered if it actually even really happened, or whether or not, it was just some story that was being told. So my main goal was to find out, when did it happen? How did it happen? What were the circumstances? Who was on the trip with him? Because he surely didn't come on his own, right? Where did they go? What did they do? Does anyone here remember meeting him? What details might there be of the trip? And, as I said earlier, how could there be a still largely undocumented episode in presidential and local history? So this was my task. And as the story snowballed, I thought it might be a page or two, maybe a few pages, a kind of a footnote. It ended up being a 250-page book that I've recently completed in 2023. And it involves three threads, right? So it's framed by the story of Richard Nixon's trip. So that's the sort of non-historical part. There's also a bit of personal story in there. It's the story of my investigation of Richard Nixon. And the Prince Edward County features as a character in the tale too, so there's a lot of local stories about different things that are connected to Nixon, some of which I'll share with you here today. And I uncovered a lot of things that, some of which have been largely forgotten locally, which I thought was really interesting. And I found some things that maybe not well appreciated more generally historically as well. So this is all really interesting to me as a former historian, someone who's interested in these kinds of things. I also was saying to one of the audience members earlier that there were these weird synchronicities that kept happening as I was doing this research and writing this book, which I really probably started writing in 2019, 2020. I had kind of been doing a little bit of research and writing, but when COVID kicked in, like everybody else, I was sitting at home and looking for ways to occupy my time. We were also fostering at the time, and so I had to have like a kind of an organized schedule. I would get up in the morning, and I was up an hour or two before our foster son, so I would actually sit and focus on that and try to get the writing. And it was kind of a good diversion. It was very grounding to kind of share community of Prince Edward while sitting at my island kitchen table in the middle of COVID, where we hadn't seen anybody for a year and a half. It was like, oh, this is so connecting for me. So in a lot of ways, there's was a very personal story in this for me as well. That comes through in the book. I don't talk so much about that here today, but when the book comes out and you read it, you will see what I mean. Okay, so that's a map of Eastern Lake Ontario. Main Duck Island is on there, which features quite prominently in the book. The first thing that occurred to me was, well, Arthur, when he told me the story of Nixon coming across and going drinking the bar, what was he doing? Could it be possible that he was visiting his friend John Foster Dulles, who was then Secretary of State, at his cottage on Main Duck Island, right? Because most people probably know JFD, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, the principal, the highest foreign affairs official in the United States, had this cottage on Main Duck Island. He bought the island from Claude King Cole, who used it as a sort of a private territory that he had. He was a rum runner in the 1920s during Prohibition, and he kept cattle on there. By the 1940s, he passed, and John Foster Dulles buys the island from Claude King Cole's widow. And the only other resident of the island at the time was, by 1957, was the lighthouse keeper, a Main Duck Island lighthouse keeper, whose name was Howard Dunn. Now, John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State, but in fact, had quite a storied family that was very important to understanding American politics. His brother was the head of the CIA, and he was also, in many ways, Nixon was a protege of John Foster Dulles. They sort of had a mentor-mentee relationship. John Foster Dulles, Nixon had a very kind of strained and difficult relation with Eisenhower, who was president. So John Foster Dulles served as the middleman between the two of them quite often. So he had this very central role, and they did a whole bunch of things around the world, right? Head of the CIA. They, sponsored a coup in Iran. They later were largely behind the Bay of Pigs, thing in the 1960s, even though John Foster Dulles was dead by then. They sponsored a coup in Indonesia. They were involved in the Vietnam War, even in the 1950s, before they, became more fully involved. They had a lot of things to do around the world. And I found this picture. That's John Foster Dulles, sort of one of his official photos. That's John Foster Dulles and Richard Nixon and Sukarno of Indonesia, who they all look very happy to be meeting, and then they turned around and basically had him killed and replaced by someone who they thought would be better for their interests, right? Suharto replaced him. So that was pretty typical in the 1950s of the kind of things that was going on and what John Foster Dulles was doing. So one of the things I found out with the help of a newspaper editor from Upper New York State who was kind enough to go through his archives and find all kinds of information about John Foster Dulles was that Dulles regularly took a float plane to Nantucket Island. That was how he got there, out of Henderson Harbor. And a few other things, little details that I found interesting. He had this little sailboat that he would take 17 kilometers off the point to Nantucket Island. It's the first of the 1,000 islands, right? And so it's a long way into the lake. And you can, on a clear day when you're out there, you can see land, but most days there are spots where you can't. You look like you're in the middle of the ocean. It's a freshwater ocean. Lake Ontario is a freshwater ocean, basically. So John Foster Dulles loved this. He'd take the seaplane out there. He'd take his little sailboat. He'd sometimes sail it up to Premier's Cove, and the people who lived up there would sometimes see him, fishing, and he would wave to them. And they say he was a regular sight, right? So not unusual to see the Secretary of State floating around Prince Edward County and Premier's Cove. He loved Maine duck because he could swim in the nude. He didn't have to, there were no connect. The only way they connect him was through a radio at the lighthouse. He could chop wood. He could go for walks. A very simple life. Far from the politics of Washington, D.C., right? In fact, he goes in the fall of 1956, according to my newspaper editor. He tried, because I thought, okay, they'll have a record of whether or not he's gone in that July 1957 when Nixon is there. No, it turns out he didn't. He did go in the fall of 1956. He tried to puzzle out the solution to the Middle East Suez crisis to stop World War III. So he flew on a plane, came to Canada, which is, I actually say in the book, this is a little ironic because it was actually Canadian Lester Pearson who did solve the Suez crisis, right? And started Canada's peacekeeping operations. So he comes to the land of the man who actually did solve the crisis. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was not successful in doing that in 1956. The other thing I found was interesting was John Foster Dulles was actually one of two Secretaries of State from Upper New York State who has connections in Rochester and across the lake. The other is William Rogers, who comes into the story a little later. So that was something that I thought was interesting as well. Okay, so I have a little excerpt from my book, just the first chapter, just to give you a sense. That, I think, probably gives you an informal sense of how I frame the story. As I say, there's a bit of a personal story in here as well, and I wrote this particular entry chapter from the first-person point of view. So I imagine Richard Nixon stepped onto the dock in Rochester, New York in 1957. There are a few pictures that record events from that weekend. As I view them now, it looks like the Vice President put a real effort into appearing casual as he escaped his responsibles on a secret Canadian getaway across the northern border to Canada. Even in that era, he's dressed oddly, khaki pants with a striped belt and a plaid shirt buttoned all the way up to his collar. A day following the American independence celebration, summer had arrived. But Nixon's stiff appearance betrayed the challenges of a public figure who, even when by himself on holidays, had trouble relaxing. Of course, no one in such a high office is ever really alone. As much as he valued privacy, virtually every little thing in the life of the future President of the United States became part of the narrative he spun about himself. Nixon's private 1957 retreat to Prince Edward County, Ontario, is a small part of that story that he told to a receptive crowd on his Ottawa state visit later in 1972. It was hard at first to appreciate that a notorious world leader, an American president no less, had this obscure connection to my quiet rural home. Many accounts of his Canadian visit are fragmented, and the missing gaps in the record of his trip intrigued and puzzled the historian in me. As with so many things about Richard Nixon, many of the details he later gave about his visit to the Bay of Quinte region were also confused or false. Facing impeachment in 1974 for covering up criminal acts, he's the only president in U.S. history who resigned. It might come as no surprise to anyone familiar with Nixon's rise and fall and his capacity for deception that he didn't always let the facts get in the way of a good story. Most of us are taught early that we shouldn't judge things by the way they look. Yet, it's hard for me more than half a century later not to see Nixon through a present lens that filters everything with the knowledge of all that went so very wrong with his presidency. My training in psychology tells me this is a cognitive error. Still, I can't help perceive imperfections in his appearance, as well as oddities in his behaviors, and connect them to his role in the infamous Watergate scandal. You can see Nixon's closely set features in the photos. It reminds me of all the old film clips where at various points in the life of the Quaker lawyer from California, who rose to such prominence, struggles even to maintain eye contact. Nixon rarely seemed entirely comfortable in public. In 1960, people noted how he visibly sweated under the hot television spotlights, seeming to all those who watched on television to lose the presidential debates. There are multiple examples through his career where he misspeaks, seems flummoxed when not working from a prepared text. Perhaps it's also true that most of his life, Nixon's always had things that he wanted to keep hidden. The scrutiny of public life can be a heavy burden on those who serve. Still, in some ways, the images I'm examining reflect a gentler time. In a generation before modern telephone and satellite communications, the second most powerful man in the world would make a 60-kilometer Great Lake crossing on a private boat to spend a weekend in a foreign country with only a few friends and no Secret Service protection. On reflection, had more known of the Vice President's jaunt, it might have been doubly worrying given President Eisenhower's significant health problems. Okay, so that frames the joint. I got a banner there. That's the Rochester Yacht Club, which is where he started on his journey. And there's a picture of Nixon, who was a decorated war veteran. He served in the Navy during World War II. I go into this in the book. One of the secrets he probably wanted to keep hidden, and why he may have been a little concerned, was as he stepped onto that dock in Rochester, he didn't really know where he was. He's a little geographically challenged. And I would imagine, having served in the South Pacific, he thought he was going to a little lake. And he looked out across and he couldn't see the other side. And because Vice President Nixon, the decorated naval veteran from World War II, suffered from lifelong seasickness. And in fact, I'll tell you right now, I think that's exactly why he ended up in Picton, because he got seasick on the journey. Okay, so I followed in the footsteps of Richard Nixon. And I went myself out to Main Duck. I got a picture of the Main Duck Lighthouse there. There's a picture of if you were coming into Picton Harbor, you'd see the sign that says, "Welcome to Picton," which most people don't see unless you go out in a boat, right? The other thing, other personal journey that I made through this, and include in the book, is I started painting during COVID. And so I actually used my opportunity to go out there and paint a few things. So that's actually a picture of me on the boat, taking a picture of me with anyways, you can see there, a little of my artistry of Main Duck Island. And so this is in 2020. That's my better half, Andrea. You can see I'm wearing a Marysburg Vortex shirt from the Prince Edward T-shirt company. And in the book, I go into some detail about all the stories about the Marysburg Vortex and Charity Shoal, which is on the eastern end of Lake Ontario, and basically is the remains of a 400 million-year-old meteorite that slammed into what's now Lake Ontario. And there are all kinds of ghost stories and stories of UFOs and compasses gone awry. And so the fact that Nixon had trouble when he sailed across and got seasick sort of was in keeping with the whole journey. In fact, I got a little seasick going out there on the day we went out. And in fact, it was like, this probably figures, right? This is exactly it. So this is on the top left-hand corner of the slide is a picture of all that remains of John Dulles' cabin. It was burned to the ground a few years ago in circumstances I won't get into, but are kind of interesting even unto themselves. And I went and I sort of, the floor is still there. I kind of stood and I kind of tried to imagine. It's smaller than the room that we're in right now. It's about half the size, I would say. And I stood on the rim and I looked and I thought, in what corner did the Secretary of the State of the United States try to stop the Suez Crisis and prevent World War III? And I looked and I thought, wow, it's so amazing. It wasn't that long ago, right? You can see, and there's no plaque or anything out there. Nobody kind of commemorates this. Anyways, it's kind of interesting. And then there's a picture of the Main Duck Lighthouse itself as you're coming in. So, of course, he gets seasick. I don't have the itinerary for Richard Nixon in 1957. He started off on July 5th, 1957, which was a Friday night. And he sailed across the lake, and he ended up at the Pitkin Yacht Club. He ended up on a boat, a 70-foot sloop that was owned by Gannett Corporation, which is a large newspaper conglomerate out of Rochester. They're rivals to the same newspaper corporation that William Randolph Hearst owned. He's more famous, Citizen Kane, right? Frank Gannett was well known in the Bay of Quinte. He used to sail this boat up and park it outside the Quinte Golf and Country Club. They had a private dock up there in the Bay of Quinte on the North Shore. And so he was well known. He is a former potential presidential candidate himself. By 1957, he was getting older, and a new man was on the up and coming, and his name was Paul Miller. And so Paul Miller actually sails the Gannett boat over to the Bay. And so I think what happened is they didn't actually. Nixon got seasick, and so this was late on Friday night. It's dark. They actually parked somewhere, Premier's Cove or somewhere offshore, and they anchored and they stayed the night on the boat. Because the witnesses I have talk about taking the lines from the boat at the Pitkin dock on Saturday morning. So they had just arrived. They hadn't come the night before and anchored. They arrived. So they came, they got sick, they maybe had a few hours sleep. They went, and I can just imagine Nixon saying to Paul Miller, I really don't want to have to sail all the way over to Belleville. Is there any way we could go somewhere and get a car and drive up to the Quinte Golf and Country Club? Because that's where they end up going at one point. Maybe they planned to be here too, play golf. I don't have any evidence that they did that, but it's possible. And so they arrive here, and Nixon gets off the boat. And one of the other things that occurred to me was, well, maybe this wasn't entirely a boys' weekend. Maybe there's some reason that he came. Nixon had this reputation for back channel communications. He would send Henry Kissinger off on secret trips, and he would go off on secret trips and engage in all kinds of diplomatic negotiations and information gathering. And so I thought, is it possible that something like that was going on in 1957, right? And this was in many ways a turning point in 1957. I should say one of the most secret things that people do know about, and it's been confirmed in the last few years, was Nixon actually sabotaged the campaign of his rival in 1968 when he was running for president. There was Vietnam peace negotiations, and he went to the other side and said, don't agree to a peace deal, because if you do, when I win, I'll give you a better deal. So he actually went out of his way to sabotage potentially peace negotiations that might have ended the Vietnam War in 1968. And so that is actually a breach of something called the Logan Act. It's considered potentially treason. And that had always been rumored, and sort of since 2014 it's been confirmed on tapes and through documents that in fact had occurred. So that was one of the secret sort of clandestine things that Nixon did in his time. 1957 was a turning point in Canadian history. Up until that point, there had been two dynasties. In the province of Ontario, you had the Progressive Conservative dynasty, right? They had been around since at least the 40s, the early 40s, and they held sway at Queen's Park. Federally, for a generation, it had been the Liberals. And this seemed like they were two immovable forces, right? Unexpectedly, in 1957, the Liberals Louis St. Laurent calls an election, and unexpectedly, a young, new progressive conservative leader named John Diefenbaker manages to win a minority government, right? They had been so sure they were going to win, the Liberals, back in 1957, that they said, well, we really should sign this peace deal, this defense alliance that we've got with the Americans, but it can wait till after the election, the NORAD peace treaty, right? The NORAD defense agreement. And so John Diefenbaker becomes prime minister in June of 1957, and the NORAD arms defense agreement is in doubt, right? And this is the thing that joins up Canadian American Air Forces and sets up, radar lines in northern Canada to try and defend against Russian bombers coming across the pole and starting a nuclear war. So this was very much in doubt, and it looked like John Diefenbaker wasn't going to sign it initially. So there was some concern that maybe they didn't know who this person was, they had never heard of him. He has this funny name. As Kennedy used to say, you call him Diefenbaker, right? And say his name sounds like he's German. They really didn't know what to expect from John Diefenbaker. So, maybe there was something more going on. I say too, I talked to you about Charity Shoal and the stories of mysterious supernatural things going to Main Deck Island. Secret technology in PEC, right? Was there some secret technology, some UFOs? And I used to always laugh at that, like, come on. And then one day in 2017, I was standing on my porch just outside Cherry Valley, looking down over the point, and I saw UFOs. There are these giant balls of glowing lights. Like, they didn't just appear and disappear. They were there 3 or 4 minutes. And they were drifting, like, long enough that I got video of it, right? I actually called Andrea. I said, God, look at this. Those are the UFOs everybody's talking about, right? And I thought, holy smokes, what are the odds here that we would see these from our, right when I'm thinking about this and the St. Marysburg vortex and the supernatural involvements. Of course, whether or not there was UFOs, there was in fact secret technology down at Point Peter in 1957, right? They were testing the engine for the Avro Arrow. And if you go on Google Maps, you can still see the Orenda Ring. Orenda Ring is where they put up a big pole in the middle, and they attach an engine on a wheeled cart, and then they fire the engine to test it. It goes in a circle around the ring. If you look at Google Maps, you can actually still see the circle on Google Maps at the Point Peter signal stations, right? And so the Avro Arrow was Canada's new fighter defense plane that was in development in 1957. And it was, when Nixon came in 1957, it hadn't yet been announced, but it was in fact secret technology. So whether or not it's UFOs, there was something going on. Of course, it was also about to be a turning point in the Cold War, right? I think it took a few years for people to understand the difference between nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. Thermonuclear bombs, as opposed to atomic bombs, are exponentially more powerful, like 10 to 20 times more powerful in terms of the explosive power. So it was in the 1950s they did a report, and this is a Toronto, a map, a very crude map of Toronto. But what would happen if just your average nuclear bomb was exploded over the center of Toronto? And it shows complete devastation in one circle, mostly devastated, some partial survival in 3. 3 is where I lived in Toronto. And this is 15 kilometers from downtown Toronto. And so that's just one bomb, right? So it was becoming increasingly clear that, bombers, dropping multiple payloads, coming over the poles, probably wasn't going to be the way this played out. And if they did, it wouldn't take a whole lot for them to do a lot of damage. One bomb could basically end the city of Toronto, not a couple or 3 or 10, right? And so they were starting to realize that this was potentially also deliverable not through bombers, but through missiles. And ICBMs were in the offing. They were starting to come. Nixon was probably privy to secret intelligence that the Russians were about to make technological breakthroughs in June and July of 1957. And in fact, in October of 1957, October 4th, they launched Sputnik, which is the first satellite to orbit the Earth, and indicates to the Americans, oh, guess what? You've got a problem. They can now shoot missiles from Russia over the pole at ballistic speeds. Fighter aircraft are not going to be able to shoot them down, folks. And I say in my book, that's maybe one of the reasons why the Avro Arrow was canceled too, because it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't going to be bombers, it was going to be ICBMs that came over the borders. So, this is all, part and parcel of the times that Nixon came to the county in. Okay, we're doing good. So he comes on Friday. I'm able to find records of the fact that he flew back to Rochester on the Monday. So he sailed over. Paul Miller was left to sail the boat back alone. Clearly, he wasn't having any more seasickness. He pretty much had it with that, right? Not clear, again, what exactly their initial plan was. I looked and looked and looked and tried to find some evidence of an official connection, like where he had set up a meeting with the defense minister to talk about the NORAD agreement or Russian technology or something. I couldn't find anything, right? But the only thing I can figure, Trenton was the Royal Air Station back then, and so to fly in and out of there, you would need special permissions. He must have had some contact at some level of officialdom to fly out of Trenton and back to Rochester on the Monday morning. It may just be entirely a coincidence that within a couple of weeks after his trip, the Canadian attitude towards NORAD and John Diefenbaker's apparent indifference to the agreement changes, and they become strong supporters, and they sign it very shortly there afterwards. Okay, and in fact, the Avro Arrow, notwithstanding the fact what I've said about it being potentially obsolete, it did go ahead. It was announced, right? It was announced on the exact same day, October 4th, 1957, as Sputnik was launched. So that was just a weird coincidence and synchronicity, one of the many that I found. I'm going to say to you, I put Captains of the Clouds. Captains of the Clouds is a 1942 movie by James Cagney, filmed mostly at the Uplands Airport in Ottawa. Features several scenes from Mountain View Airport, and includes Nixon's favorite Hollywood star, which was James Cagney. And is set in Trenton. So it's actually a very popular movie in the 1940s. Nixon was a cinephile, which I go into in the book as well, because it's really interesting to see what his policy. He would watch certain movies and then his policies would change, and so it's really interesting to see. Before he engages in an escalation of bombing in Vietnam, he watches Patton like 3 times. Right, really interesting stuff, right? I'm pretty sure he had seen this movie, so he at least was peripherally aware of the importance of the armed forces, the air base. There would have been soldiers potentially on the streets, Main Street in Picton when he was here. So he wouldn't have been surprised to see that, and he probably had some sense of, he probably saw them when he went to the Royal Air Station up in Trenton. Okay, other synchronicities while I'm writing the book. NORAD doesn't make the news very often, but they ended up, in the last couple of years, they've now shot down 2 UFOs over Canadian airspace, one over the Yukon, one over Lake Huron in 2023. I thought, okay, this is weird. And then they also have been searching for full-scale, small-scale models of the Avro Arrow that they were shooting out in aerodynamics tests over Point Peter, and they actually found them. So while I was researching this, these just appeared in the news. So this is a photo courtesy of Trevor Van Cott, some of you may know, kind enough to let me use this photo. And it's a photo of Nixon and Harvey and a couple of other people on the dock in Prince Edward County. And so you can see that's the plaid shirt that you see being talked about there earlier, and you can see Harvey in his tie. He has a hat on that we'll see in the next picture, which he was also famous for wearing. Harvey's got his arm around Nixon. And of course, Ernie Marguson, our former counselor, was telling me about his interest in H.J. McFarlane. Everybody knows just how gregarious H.J. McFarlane was, right? And well before he met Nixon. He was at the coronation, which is a picture of him there at the coronation. That chair is actually the property of county museums. Jessica Chase is here from county museums.
Well, it's not that chair, but we have a chair.
Oh, it isn't that chair?
Yes. So
okay.
I mean, the chair he sat in Westminster Abbey
for
the coronation is the one that we have.
Okay. Yeah. See, now I have to edit my book. Okay.
We'll talk.
Yeah, okay. But it gets put on display every once in a while. So he was obviously he used his position as mayor to become friends with, all kinds of people, prime ministers. And I tell the story, I think Lynn Pickering, I tell the story. One time he was, during the war, he was trying to get paid for constructing Mountain View Air Base, and he was rushing down the Treasury Office building in Ottawa, and he was running because he was like late, and he had a lot of things to do, and it's like all business people, right? He needed money, right? He had deliverables, and he was always trying to meet payroll and all that kind of thing, right? Anyways, wouldn't you know, somebody comes out the door and he bowls into them. It's the Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King. He says, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to, I'm rushing. I'm trying to get a check, and they're sending me from place to place." And he goes, "Well," he gets him to explain what the situation is with the Air Force Base. He says, "Give me your name and your number, and I'll call the Treasury office, and I'll get the check expedited." And within an hour, H.J. McFarlane. So, he was friends with Mackenzie King. He was friends with the Queen. He was friends with Nixon. That picture is one of my paintings based on a photo from. So Harvey, interesting. I don't think Harvey knew he was coming. He was sick. Harvey was sick that day. Somebody must have called him. I think Pat Hodgson, who was the Gazette photographer, called him and said, Vice President Nixon's in the harbor. Of course, Harvey, president friends with Mackenzie King and the Queen. He's not going to miss a chance to, even if he's sick, he's not going to miss a chance to meet the Vice President of the United States, right? So he rushes down, and so what do you do when you go meet the Vice President of the United States? You get dressed up. You get dressed up even on a hot, sunny Saturday morning. You get dressed up, you get your best clothes on, and you go with gifts. So what does he bring? So some of the records say he gave him black diamond cheddar cheese. But that's an American saying that, and I think actually Harvey owned the Black River cheddar cheese factory at the time. I think he actually had some Black River cheddar cheese in his fridge, and he brought that down. He also happened to have a gallon of real maple syrup, which he thought would be a fitting gift for the vice president. And I think he must have known that Nixon liked to drink, because he brought a bottle of Crown Royal rye whiskey. And so this is really interesting, because this starts a friendship that lasts for the next 15 years, till the end of Harvey's life, and to the end, almost to the end of Nixon's time in office. So this is really quite fascinating. End of Harvey's life, which is also, Watergate was 50 years ago today in August of 1974. In 1970, Harvey McFarlane regains, 1972, he regains the office of mayor. He had vacated the office for a couple of years. Margaret Ackerman had taken over the mayoralty. And in 1972, he decides he wants back in, and he runs and wins again. And of course, he suffered from a chronic heart condition, like not just then, but for many years prior. And he dies of a massive heart attack on January 14, 1974, almost 50 years ago. And this is now, Watergate is kind of almost at its full fury. Like, it seems like only a matter of time before Nixon's probably going to have to resign, or something's going to happen. And despite the fact that Watergate was at its full fury, and Nixon had other things on his mind. There was a Mideast crisis, as there has been for many years, and every year since then, right? He had Vietnam to worry about. He had many other things. Nixon actually writes Mrs. McFarlane this note, which gets published in many places, and I've just recreated it here. He writes a very personal note. He says, "I'm sorry to hear about this. I'm sorry to hear." So, it's just a testament, I think, to the connection that they had from 1957 to 1974. That the President of the United States would write a personal condolence note to the widow of Mrs. McFarlane, to Mr. McFarlane. So a couple of other things. So the trip where Nixon talks about his Picton visit occurs in 1972, and this is before Watergate. So none of the bad stuff is broken yet. Nixon's actually about starting his re-election campaign, and he comes to Ottawa for his only state visit to Ottawa. And he meets with Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who's sitting on a book there. He actually lands at Uplands Airport. He probably didn't know it, but that runway had been paved by the Harvey J. McFarlane paving company. Right, so interesting. Another little interesting tidbit is there was an assassin in the crowd in Ottawa. Arthur Bremer was there. And he had come across Lake Huron by boat and had hidden a gun. And he'd done that because he thought they might not search him quite as closely as if he'd come across somewhere else. And it was his intention to kill President Nixon. And he followed Nixon around Ottawa for the entire 36 hours there and never found a chance to kill him. He does go on and shoot one of the other presidential candidates later in the campaign. But Nixon's staff were concerned about security. The RCMP actually went so far as an April visit. There was still snow. Spring was late that year. There was actually snow. They went so far as to hose down the snowbanks on Parliament Hill because they were afraid protesters would wing snowballs at Richard Nixon. And his whole main thing here ostensibly was to sign a Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and to address a joint session of Parliament. A few other things happened, though, that are kind of funny. Again, synchronicities, right? First of all, on the left there, you a picture of Pat Nixon, who's Mrs. Nixon, right? It's the wife of Richard Nixon, visiting with Margaret Trudeau at 24 Sussex Drive and holding Margaret's new baby, whose name is Justin Trudeau. And, so this is kind of interesting because in 7 months prior, Pierre Trudeau had actually been in Picton himself. He helicoptered in, landing at the baseball diamond at the Picton Fairgrounds. And he sat in the stands, and then he got up and he made his speech, notwithstanding the fact that George Heath tried to steal the spotlight. George Heath was the MP at the time. Nixon, you see Pierre Trudeau, you can see he had a reputation for fancy dress. He's in a white linen suit with a yellow carnation. So this wasn't like a late-breaking thing. It seems like Trudeau did this even when he was going to a country fair in a place like Picton, right? Anyway, so he makes a speech. And I had that story. I've been told by a few people different aspects of that story, so that's included in the book as well. I can't give you all the secrets of the book. So that's one I save for later. The other thing I wanted to say is, so in the speech in 1972 when he's talking about his visit to Picton, actually, it's not very long, I'll read an excerpt for you in a bit. But the part that doesn't get recorded is he actually stands up at one of the dinners and he says, and I want to toast the Prime Minister of Canada and his new son, the future Prime Minister of Canada. And they all have a champagne toast. And it's like, oh my goodness, this is just so, the timing is just so amazing. It's pretty interesting. Anyways. Okay, so I'm going to read the excerpt from Nixon in just a sec, but I just want to give you a little more context. In fact, Nixon had sailed over in 1957 about 3 days after Hurricane Audrey had run through the southern Ontario, but up from Texas. Was one of the worst, like very difficult, killed hundreds of people in the United States, did millions of dollars of damage, killed at least one person in the county village of Northport. And so, when you have bad weather systems, they drag in high pressure systems behind them. That's what happened. So there was a nice weather on the Friday night, but there was still wind about, which is why when Nixon got on the boat, there was probably offshore breeze when he got on Rochester. But when he got out in the middle of the lake, of course, the lake, there's 150 kilometers of wind to drive those rollers, right? He was going over some big rollers. And having been out there with 6 or 8 foot rollers and starting to feel sick, I can just imagine. It's Letitia Humans, who was helped establish the Temperance Union, came by boat. She got seasick. She said the trip across Lake Ontario was worse than the Atlantic Ocean. The rollers were worse than the Atlantic Ocean. So, it's pretty notorious weather that Nixon was facing when he came across, which you're going to hear him describe. You're going to see in the story that I do, he also describes a pub. And one of the questions I had was, could it have been the Royal Hotel that he was visiting here in Picton? Actually, so I do a little journalism too. I was writing for County Live, and I got to interview Greg Sabara, who's the current owner of the Royal Hotel. And I said to him at the end of the interview, do you know that Richard Nixon might have stopped in the Royal Hotel for a drink at some point in 1957? Without missing a beat, he says, well, if I'd known that, I never would have bought the place. Perfect. So he gets quoted in the book. Okay, so I'm going to say there's a couple things. I'll read it, and then I'll just go over a couple of these things because they're kind of interesting for you to watch for. You're going to hear errors in some of the things Nixon says. As I said, he was a notorious confabulist. He would make things up and he'd get details wrong. And it was just interesting to follow some of the details here. So this is from the public papers of the President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon. So I'm reading his actual words, right? I had an early reviewer look at this and tell me that the writing was terrible. And I said, well, I didn't write it. Richard Nixon or a speechwriter did, so you can't blame me for this. Anyways. But there was one particular, I might do a little bit of an imitation too. I don't do a very good Richard Nixon, but I try. But there was one particular occasion, I think, that stays in my mind more than all the others. I have been to Picton. Now, most Americans will not know what Picton is, but Canadians will know. Or maybe you don't. But in the year 1957, the Secretary of State and I was then Vice President, and he was Attorney General of the United States. We were invited by the publisher of the Rochester paper, Mr. Paul Miller, to sail across Lake Erie and to go over to the Canadian side and see the beauties of Canada. It was a wonderful trip. I didn't realize even then that on Lake Erie, one could get seasick. But finally, when I saw Canadian soil, believe me, it was the most welcome soil I ever stepped on. But the incident which I would like to leave on this occasion with our friends from Canada was what happened in Picton that day. It was a Saturday night. We had played golf earlier in the day. We were still in our sports clothes, in sports jackets, and we decided to go to one of the local pubs, just as we were. We went in and sat down. We had no Secret Service at the time with us, and the waiter looked us all over, and some way he seemed to think he recognized me. But he wasn't sure. We noted, or Secretary Rogers at least noted, as he was then Attorney General, and is supposed to note such things, that the waiter was talking to the bartender after serving us. The bartender was looking over and saying, oh no, it can't be, it can't be. After we finished, he was a very polite waiter. After we had finished and were ready to leave, the waiter came up and said, sir, if you don't mind, I have a bet with the bartender. and you can help me win it, or I might just lose it. I said, what's the bet? He said, I bet him $5 that you are Vice President Nixon. I said, well, call him over and we'll confirm it. So the bartender came over and said, is it true? I said, yes. He said, I would never have believed it. He gave them the $5, and as we started to move on, I heard him mumble to the waiter, you know, he doesn't look near as bad in person as he does in pictures. This is Nixon. Now that little story tells us something about why this trip is so important and why it's quite necessary. Many of you, maybe none of us look quite as bad in person as we may in our pictures. And we Canadians and Americans must never miss an opportunity to see each other in person. So that's the story. It's not recorded anywhere. It's in his written paper. So he spoke that. Then there's a note at the bottom that says he spoke without notes. So he was at a buffet dinner. He was not expected to go to the buffet dinner. And he was asked to respond to a toast that the Governor General had made, and he got up and he told that story just off the top of his head, right? So it was completely extemporaneous. It hadn't been planned, I don't think. And so you see some things in there, right? Like he keeps mentioning Lake Erie. Nixon was geographically challenged, or he forgot, or he made a mistake. But it was more than one mistake, because he made the mistake a couple of times, right? He said he's on Lake Erie. He mentions William Rogers. Now, William Rogers was on the 1972 trip. William Rogers, people forget, was Nixon's first Secretary of State, was Secretary of State for 4 years, overshadowed by Henry Kissinger, but actually spent longer as Secretary of State than Henry Kissinger did. Also from Upper New York State and Rochester area. I can't find any evidence he was actually on the 1957 trip. So my question is, why was Nixon saying he was there when he probably wasn't? And I think he was kind of sucking up to Rogers because the election was coming, and I think Rogers, the Watergate thing, or maybe something was going on, Rogers was thinking about leaving. Nixon was trying to get him to stay. So I can only speculate as to why he might have said Rogers was there. He says, one of the waiters, in the remarks, he reports the waiter saying he has the person calling him sir. And so there's a thing about, you see, one of the journalists who covers Donald Trump says, anytime Donald Trump, he's gone through all the times Donald Trump says, is quoted as saying sir, and then somebody says something, they can never find the person who actually said the thing. And so the journalist says that whenever somebody says that, they're actually probably making it up, or they're telling an apocryphal story. And so he says, maybe, I think that maybe what was going on here. And as I say, Nixon was a notorious confabulist. He would just make up whole stories. And this goes back a long time. Like some things, I tell him the story of his poker winnings. He uses poker winnings to fund his first campaign in 1946 in the war. And he goes around, he tells every single biographer, repeats the story that he learned to play poker in the war. He's a natural at bluffing and being sneaky, right? No. The FBI interviewed him in 1937 for a job, and he reported that he regularly played poker. So after the fact, he came up with this detail. I think he wanted people to think that he was naturally good at poker and that this was, an important skill for a politician to have. And so he would just make stuff up like that all the time, right? My question is, of course, did the story in the bar really happen? I'm not going to tell you. You read the book. Some version of it happened, but not the way he said or how he said. Okay, so I'm going to leave that for you to look. Again, another synchronicity. Guess who's coming to PEC? I'm writing about a world leader coming to the county and going for a drink in a bar and spending a weekend to meet the mayor. Guess who shows up in the middle of my research? The Prime Minister of Canada shows up in 2018 with his wife Sophie. They visit Hinterland Winery and they spend the weekend and run into Mayor Quaife over in Wellington. We're in Wellington, right? It's like, okay, this is just weird that this would happen, that I'm doing that. So I just thought that was funny. Okay, so I'm getting close to being done, but just want to cover a couple more things. Of course, Nixon's downfall was through the Watergate scandal, right? And so one of the things my editor said to me was, what's Watergate? And she's an older lady. She's like, I don't even remember. I was there, and I don't even remember the details. So just a few details. It occurs, the scandal part of it occurs in 1972. And so it had actually occurred prior to Harvey McFarlane's visit to the White House. Right? It occurred in June that year. And what were later called the plumbers were caught breaking into the Watergate buildings. It was, I think, part of a broader plan that was had been proposed a year before. It included like some pretty extreme things, including setting up internment camps to arrest war protesters and they never followed through on it, or not most of it. Some of the things they did follow through on, some of the dirty tricks campaigns. And the White House was very much concerned about the leak of information from high-profile officials. And so when G. Gordon Liddy, who was one of the plumbers, was asked, what do you do for the president? And he says, I'm a plumber. I work as a plumber over there. I stop the leaks. I stop the leaks of information. That's why they called them the plumbers, right? So Nixon was in the middle of preparing for his nomination to the Republican ticket for the fall in 1972. It's the 5th time he would appear in the presidential contest of a major party, and only FDR holds that record. So he holds a record there. The group that was still pursuing some of the dirty tricks was called the Committee to Re-elect the President. Rather unfortunately, acronym is CREEP. Of course, Nixon had some secrets he wanted kept hidden, not the least of which is the fact that he'd probably committed treason by sabotaging the peace negotiations back in 1968, which we've only just come to appreciate, by the way. What's Watergate? Watergate is 6 buildings in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Was designed by Benito Mussolini's favorite architect and is a mixed commercial and residential space. There's a hotel, there's living apartments, there's shopping, and so it's also home to the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. And so they had files in there that when they got caught on June 17, 1972, is actually the 2nd time they had broken into those offices. The first time they'd gone in and left lifting devices, and the batteries had run out. So they were breaking back in to replace the batteries. They weren't very good crooks. They weren't very good, so it's not surprising they got caught. And they had done other things too. And I detail some of these in the book. It's pretty quite remarkable when you read it. And so how do we know all about this? So they start the Watergate investigation, and then in 1973 it comes out that Nixon had secretly installed tapes in the Oval Office, and all of his conversations have been taped since about 1971 onwards. And so they immediately start pressing, as they are now, trying to get evidence from a senior government official in the United States to try and get the tapes so that they can see what actually happened, right? And one of the people responsible for those tapes was Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, who was a personal assistant, really, had been with him for years. There was an incident where 18 minutes of the tape were deleted, were erased, and how did that happen? And so Rosemary Woods said, well, I was doing the transcribing on the machine and the phone rang and I had my foot on the pedal and I accidentally hit the erase button and I went and I talked on the phone and they said, well, show us at your desk how that might have happened. And so they did this, and it looked like, this was called the famous Rosemary stretch, because it didn't look like that she could hold that pose for 18 minutes and keep her foot on the pedal, right? So nobody believed that this had been actually accidental, that Nixon appeared to be actively involved in a cover-up. In fact, they do find a tape that from June 17th that suggests that the smoking gun tape that that he knew about it, and even if he didn't know about it before, he knew about it afterwards and then actively tried to cover it up. So when Harvey came, though, his friend in the White House was Rosemary Woods. She's the one that gets him in, right? She's the one that gets him in. She makes time for him and allows him to sit in the office, and then at an appropriate opportunity goes into Nixon. I don't actually have that tape here, but there's a tape where she's talking to the fact that Harvey has just shown up at the door, because Harvey just shows up in 1972. And Harvey's shown up at the door and is sitting in the outer office, and could we possibly get him in here to have a picture? He's come all this way, and Harvey flew down and he was on his way to Miami for the Republican National Convention, right? So it was Rosemary Woods that actually gets Harvey in the door. And when I was interviewed by Lynn Pickering on Sunday, she said, can you just show up at the president's office? I said, well, apparently, if you're Elvis Presley, you can, because he did the same thing in 1970. He just showed up, and to the point where he got out of the car, and the Secret Service agents at the front gate of the White House didn't know who he was. He had to explain to them, I'm Elvis Presley, and I've got this note that I'd like to give to the president. I'd like to meet. Well, they were like, what? Who is this guy? Like, this is some crazy person, right? So they phone up, and the person that gets him in then is this man, Bud Eagle Crow, who is a special advisor and a lawyer who I had the pleasure of meeting in 2010. He had a book about the Watergate scandal. He was one of the people responsible for the committee to re-elect the president. So he was deeply involved, and he lied to Congress and went to jail for 6 months. He eventually is contempt of Congress, and he goes to jail. And so he had a lot to say to me about, and everybody else too, it's public record, about what happened during that time period. And he's the one that gets Nixon not Nixon, Elvis Presley in the door. So I have a sound clip, which I'm going to try to play for you. So this is like a 2-minute clip so I'm going through the Watergate tapes because I'm trying to find the smoking gun tape, and I'm trying to find other evidence of Watergate. And wouldn't you know, I trip across Harvey McFarlane in the White House. And so it's a very scratchy tape, but you're going to hear Nixon talking. You're going to hear Harvey McFarlane. I said to Ernie Margson earlier, you could definitely hear the twang in his voice and the accent. And it's just like, wow, you know, you can just picture him as he's talking. And it does become clearer at one point as he's talking, so you should be able to hear it. So I'm hoping this will work. Okay, sorry. I'm going to start it from the beginning. I had been fooling around earlier trying to make sure that I could actually play it, but I want to start it from the very beginning, so I'm going to move it over here. It's halfway through the story I want you to hear. Okay, so he gets in the door. Nixon has left the room. Rosemary Woods is there to chat with him until the photographer comes, and while Nixon comes in. And so they're waiting for Nixon to come. So they have a few words, and then Nixon arrives. It's the photographer. Sorry. So he's giving him gifts now. The president is giving Harvey gifts. He's trying to convince him that it's nice stuff he's giving the mayor of Picton, president of the United States. Okay, so there's a couple things in there. First of all, it's just interesting to hear the voices, right? I can hear the accent. It sounds to me like a county accent. Now I'm told he was born in Roblin, so maybe it was a Roblin accent, right? There's a couple things, though. He talks about all the things you've sent me. Well, Harvey wouldn't let a good opportunity go by. And for every year from 1967 to 1974, he sent Nixon a Christmas card. He used to send him regular gifts of cheese and Crown Royal. And he says all that Crown Royal. Nixon was a big drinker, right? And to the point that Alan Capon, who was Harvey McFarlane's biographer, says that H.J. McFarlane was Nixon's second most prolific gift giver in the world. He's the only one other person gave more gifts to the President of the United States than Harvey J. McFarlane. So Nixon had every reason to want to, say, hey, thanks very much, and he's giving him these gifts in return. The other piece that I talk about in the book that isn't in this presentation, but I'll just tell you, is so he gives him an ashtray, and he gives him, some clips, and a few little things. He has a badge from the White House. Well, Harvey comes back to Picton, and he holds a press conference, and he calls in the Gazette and all the other local newspapers, and he says, he called me his Canadian ambassador, and look how important I am, and he uses that as a press conference to relaunch his political campaign that he then wins in the fall. So I just thought it was so funny, right? So interesting. So anyways, okay, so we are getting towards the end here. Let me just find the PowerPoint. Okay, there it is. Okay, so one of the things I think was surprising about Nixon that I found was his personal qualities. You can see it in a couple things that happened in Picton, a couple things that happened in his early life. Most people think of him as not a very nice person, typical politician. Maybe he lied a little bit. Maybe he'd manipulate people. And he probably did do all those things, to be honest. But I was actually surprised to read all these stories of sort of how nice he was. His family owned a grocery store in Whittier, California. And as a young boy, his mother caught a woman shoplifting during the Depression in the store, and she was picking up the phone to call the police. And as an 8-year-old, young Richard Nixon convinced her to put the phone down and extend the woman a line of credit rather than send her to the jail. He regularly, when he was at Duke University Law School, would take a classmate afflicted with polio. He'd meet him every day at the bottom of the stairs and carry him up so he could carry him in his arms up the stairs so he could hear the lecture. He didn't claim credit for this, right? He just did these things because he just thought that when he was in Picton, he meets Ken Richmond and Herb Stone, two pre-teenager boys who are still around. Herb is still here in Picton. Ken is a county born and bred, but now lives over near Barrie. Both of whom have done interviews for me, and their stories are included in the book. He takes them on a tour around Main Street, Picton. They run into a homeless man on the street. Picton, the Vice President of the United States not only goes over, he's ranting and raving. He's homeless and he's probably either intoxicated or mentally ill or both. And he was known throughout the town as somebody who, probably drank too much. And Nixon takes the time to go over and talk to him and offers him to give him money and he doesn't actually have his wallet, he gets one of his buddies to give him money. But he gives him a homeless man a gift of money. And it was like, what? That wasn't the Nixon I expected to find, right? And of course, he loved dogs. Checkers saved his political career in 1952. And he had dogs later. I go into that in a story too. Lots of the story on the tape that Krista Richardson, who's Picton Archives, Prince Edward County Archives, confirmed the story for me because I'd heard it on the tape, and then she told me about somebody who'd come in and told her the story independently. So I have some corroboration of that story with the little boy and him coming into thing there. So very quickly, who else was on the trip? Carl Hallauer, who is the chairman of Bosch and Lomb. Paul Miller is at the end. And C.R. Smith, who is an aviation pioneer. All well-heeled supporters who could donate money to the Republican Party and support Nixon. Nixon, 1957 was a turning point in the civil rights movement as well. There was a Civil Rights Act before Congress, and one of the people on board the boat who came with him to Nixon was state senator from Virginia, Harry F. Flood. And he was a segregationist, and he opposed segregation, integration in the school system. And Nixon, people remember him today as being not very good on race relations, maybe even a racist. He had a lot of racist things to say on the Watergate tapes, but actually has a very strong record on race relations. In the 1950s, he had the support of Martin Luther King and of Jackie Robinson for the Civil Rights Act. I can only imagine Harry Flood's chagrin when he found out that he was going on a boat trip with Nixon to Prince Edward County, because Prince Edward County, Virginia, our namesake down in the state of Virginia, was the site of one of the famous desegregation cases, Prince Edward County in Darling, that came before the U.S. Supreme Court and resulted in the striking down of the segregation laws that allowed for integration. Now, there's another connection. It was just another synchronicity. The interesting thing that I found out about 1968 when Nixon was elected, fewer than 10% of schools are actually integrated. By the time he leaves in 1974, over 90% of schools in the States had been integrated through enforcement, federal enforcement of court orders. And that was Nixon's doing. He insisted that that occur. So he doesn't have a great record history. People don't remember a great record on race relations, but he actually has a pretty good record. Okay. Oh, I think I might have just closed. That's okay, I can get it back. Okay. So some unanswered questions. Did Nixon go drinking in a bar? I'm going to say to you something like that happened, but I won't tell you the details. You read the book. Did he go golfing in Canada? I'm going to say to you there's a story there too that's quite interesting. What might Nixon have later made up details about County's story, and I have some speculations about why that might have occurred. I was particularly interested in connections between now and then around rule of law. And of course, there's a whole section on law and order in the county at the time, in the 50s and earlier, that I talk about. And of course, one of the reasons I'm interested in this, one of the reasons I was interested in talking to Bug Crow about advising the President of the United States is I spent about a decade advising the Chief Justice of the Superior Court around how to run the court system. So, my understanding of law and order in this comes, I think, probably honestly. What else? In what ways did Richard Nixon set the stage for modern politics? I think a few. Does Nixon still resonate with us today? Yes, good and bad. And what are some more of the synchronicities I observed to reflect both present times and my own? That's Ben Fountain, who is one of the mentor writers who provided some input onto my book a few years ago at the Humber School of Writing. Okay, so searching for Richard Nixon, finding refuge and making home in PCC is currently being queried before agents and publishers. Fingers crossed. I'm hoping to have it out before the end of the year. I got a picture of Nixon engaging in what was probably his favorite sport, which is bowling, which I go into in the book as well, because that's kind of an interesting side story as well. So I'd be happy to take questions, but let me just say right now, thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it.